You are no longer pregnant. I felt helpless as I heard the doctor say that to my wife. We walked back to our married housing apartment at Moody Bible Institute in Chicago. And once the door was closed, we cried. After a while, I went to my computer. I put on a song. It was written by an acquaintance of ours from our church. His name's John. And his words were like medicine to our souls. When the sea is calm and all is right, when I feel your favor flood my life, even in the good I'll follow you. When the boat is tossed upon the waves, when I wonder if you'll keep me safe, even in the storms I'll follow you. I believe everything that you say you are. I believe and I have seen your unchanging heart in the good things and in the hardest part. I believe, and I will follow you. Even though we already had all the words memorized to that song, it was like we were listening to it for the first time. Maybe you have a song like that you run to for comfort. Songs, even familiar songs, really can be a place of comfort in moments of confusion or disorientation or uncertainty. You know, so far we've spent all of 2022 walking through the book of Hebrews, and we've already made it to chapter 5, verse 10. And one of the things that we've noticed over and over again is how frequently the author of Hebrews quotes the Psalms. And it makes sense, right? He's writing to Hebrew believers in the early church. Now, he's been really urgent about some things so far, and he's going to get even more urgent as the book goes on. But his urgency is pastoral. As he's urged them to hold fast, to draw near with confidence, not to harden their hearts, he interlaces his exhortation, his urgency, with song, with their songs, their comforts in time of trouble. And so, we're going to take the next 4 weeks to dig into some of the Psalms that the author of Hebrews leans on most heavily. The Psalms, they're like right in the middle of your Bible. The Psalms are the Hebrew songbook. They are worship to the Lord for different occasions. We're going to take the next 4 weeks to dig into some of those, and maybe they will start to become as much of a comfort to us as they were to the original readers of the book of Hebrews. Would you please meet me in your copy of God's Word in Psalm 110. Psalm 110 is where we're spending our time this morning. If you forgot a Bible or you don't have one, there should be a hardback blue Bible somewhere underneath a chair in front of you. And you can find Psalm 110 on page 509 of those Bibles. Psalm 110. Just a little bit about this psalm. It is what is known as a royal psalm. This is a psalm that would have been sung by the people of Israel to the king of Israel. But with it, and of course we sit in a really privileged place in history, right? We get to see some things that would have been harder for the people at the time that this psalm was written to see. This psalm was not only written to their current king, a king named David, but it was also written to the king that would come through David. Not just their current king, but their eternal king. And if you'd like to know who that is, you can flip forward to the New Testament and read through the genealogy, and you can see that the descendant of David, who would be the ultimate fulfillment of the promises in this psalm, is none other than Jesus Christ. It's pretty cool. All that to say, this psalm had immediate meaning to the people who sang it originally. And it carries with it an eternal meaning. It does both at the same time. That's a little bit tough for us as Western thinkers to think about things as both and. I was actually talking to Wei about that earlier this week. It can be kind of hard for us as Western thinkers to think in terms of both ands. We like to think of either or, but you just need to know that this psalm had immediate hope for the people who were singing it and an ultimate eternal hope that was tied to it as well. Something else to note about this psalm, Psalm 110, hopefully it doesn't take you very long to realize that on that very first line in the very first verse, there's two lords in this passage. And so I'm going to give you, how many of you like life hacks? You're like, yep, show me the easiest, quickest way to do something. Here's a little life hack about most English translations. When you see Lord and it's all caps, so you can see how it's capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, and the capitals, the last three letters might be a little bit shorter, but they're still capitalized. That is telling you that in the original text, the author was using the covenant name for God, and that is Yahweh. And so it's really important that we know that heading into this. And then that second Lord there, the Lord says to my Lord, like I said, this is a royal song sung by the people to the king, and that right there is a term of honor, respect to the current king of Israel, and like we said, to the eternal king of Israel. And so I just wanted to straighten that out because it can get really confusing. There's two lords in here. So what I'm going to do is as I read the passage, every time it's the capital L-O-R-D, I'm going to put Yahweh afterwards so that we can help keep them straight. Everybody with me? Everybody understand what I just said? Great, here we go. Let's jump in. The superscript there above the verse 1 says, this is a psalm of David. Psalm 110, verse 1. The Lord, Yahweh, says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool, your footstool. The Lord, Yahweh, sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter. Rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people will offer themselves freely on the day of your power, in holy garments. From the womb of the morning, the dew of your youth will be yours. The Lord Yahweh has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And then here the perspective shifts and the people start singing to the people about their king. The Lord is at your right hand. He will shatter kings on the day of his wrath. He will execute judgment among the nations, filling them with corpses. He will shatter chiefs over the wide earth. He will drink from the brook by the way. Therefore, he will lift up his head. I'd like to title the message this morning, The Lord Has Sworn. I'm grabbing that right there from verse 4. As we've been studying through the book of Hebrews, that book is what we would call teaching, or the technical word, I know some of you like the technical word, didactic literature. meaning it is for the purpose of training, instruction, education, and there are, it's really easy to break it down into an outline, and this definitely has a flow of thought, but this is different. This is poetic, or what we would call wisdom literature. So Hebrews is didactic literature. The Psalms are a form of wisdom literature, and so because this is a different form, my sermon's going to take a different form than it has as we've been walking through the book of Hebrews. What I'm going to do is we're going to walk through this psalm, try to understand the imagery, the poetry in it, and then I'm going to give us one big takeaway at the end. So I know some of you are avid note takers, and I love that you're avid note takers. So when you haven't had a big idea yet presented on the screen or out loud, I didn't want you to think you'd missed something. You haven't missed anything. We're saving it for the end. Everybody with me? Great, great. Verse 1, the Lord, Yahweh, says to my Lord, the King of Israel, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. That term there, an honor of respect for the king. And in the minds of the people, like we said, they are singing this to their current king, knowing that everything in this psalm will ultimately be fulfilled in the Messiah that is to come through the line of David. So this psalm has immediate relevance and eternal relevance, and this image right here, it's a pretty stark image, right? That the king, hey, what's going to happen to the enemies when the king's done with them? They're going to be foot furniture, right? That's not a place of being highly exalted. That's a place of humiliation. And you have to understand that for the people of Israel, they were so frequently humble in their forces, their military forces, in the face of huge, dominating nations of bullies around them. And so this is a stroke of massive hope for their people, that their king will one day have his enemies serve as his footstool. It's quite an image. But the thing I really want to call your attention to here in verse 1 is the word until. Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. This is victory, and it's not victory that's conditional on the king doing something. You notice that? It doesn't say, sit at my right hand, and if you do, I'll make your enemies your footstool. Or, when you do, I'll make your enemies your footstool. He is saying, the day of victory is coming. Massive hope. I've thought a lot about the people of Israel as we've seen the Russian troops kind of massing on the border of Ukraine. I'll tell you what, a week ago, I never would have thought that Ukraine could put up the fight that they are putting up. Never would have dreamt it, right? A comparatively humble nation from a military stance with a monster living next door. Right? I mean, it's just so incredible. And the people of Israel were so frequently outnumbered. And this is certain victory sourced by God himself for them. What hope. What hope this provided for them. Verse 2. The Lord sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter. Rule in the midst of your enemies. A couple of images here that we might not be familiar with. The first is a scepter. And I feel like we have like kind of an inherent understanding of what a scepter represents. Like if you had walked in the back of this room and Steve had been sitting up here on a big fancy chair with a scepter in his hand, right? You would have come to the conclusion, that guy's in charge. I don't know exactly what all the scepter's about, but that guy's in charge, right? And that is the right conclusion to come to about a scepter. Steve, I don't have a scepter for you. Sorry, brother. But he's like, that's fine. That's fine. That's fine. And so this scepter is a symbol of authority. Okay? And there's a difference between authority and influence and power. I remember hearing a pastor say one time, this is so clarifying for me, on a football field, the coach has influence, the center has power, the player has power, and the ref has authority, right? And don't get me wrong, the eternal King of Israel, Jesus Christ, has all three. What this is talking about is his authority, right? This is talking about his authority, this scepter. And then what is Zion? Zion is the name of the mountain that Jerusalem, the hill that Jerusalem was built on. Jerusalem is also called the city of David. So there's a lot in this right here. So what the people are singing as they sing this song to their king is that the Lord is going to send your authority out. It's not only going to be in your city, it's going out from your city, out from Zion, sent forth from Zion. And where is it going to end up? Where is his authority going to end up? It's going to end up, it says in the last part of verse 2, rule in the midst of your enemies. That these enemies that look so big and scary to the people of Israel are going to be ruled from Zion, ruled from Jerusalem, the city of David, by the King of Israel. And what's going to happen on that day? Verse 3, your people will offer themselves freely on the day of your power in holy garments. That term, holy garments, you see the similar term used in the original language in 2 Chronicles 20. If you want to look that up later, you can, where it's called a holy array. You see it in 1 Chronicles 16, where it's called the splendor of holiness. It's referred to in the psalm that I read to open our worship service this morning. And the idea is something like this for this passage, that before the battle even starts, God's people are dressed for victory. Before the battle even starts, you can look around and you know who's on whose team. And that might sound like a really empowering thing unless you consider that you are likely, from a human standpoint, outnumbered and outgunned. Right? Then you might not want to be so clear about whose team you're on. But on the day of power, everyone's coming out dressed for the occasion. And they're going to offer themselves freely in it. It'd be like a NBA team showing up to the NBA Finals already wearing the championship hat. That's saying something, right? I think the New England Patriots did that a few years ago. They sent out with their season tickets passes to the conference championship. Like, hey, conference championship, you just get it with a season pass to our team because we're always going there. It's saying something. They're dressed for the occasion. It's the people saying, we are going to offer ourselves freely to the building of your kingdom, King of Israel. And when we show up, you'll know whose team we're on and how we believe it's going to end. It's saying something. It's a statement. It's worth noting that verse is not about wearing church clothes. Jeans are fine. Hallelujah. I got a fist pump. I got a fist pump from the sound booth. Here we go. Here we go. This is great. This is great. Verse 3. We just did verse 3. Verse 4. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You, King of Israel, are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Okay, I told you last week we'd get into this week, and we're going to. I'm not going to lead us to any firm conclusions because, like I said before, Pastor Dave will be back in a few weeks, and he'll be preaching from Hebrews chapter 7 that walks all the way through Melchizedek, and so we're going to leave some of those conclusions to that time. But I said last week that Melchizedek is the first priestly figure that we see in the Old Testament. And we learned last week that a priest is chosen by God from among men to offer sacrifices to God for sins, and that he deals gently with the ignorant and wayward. And aren't we glad that we have a great high priest who deals gently with the ignorant and wayward, right? I'm so glad. On my best day, I am 1.5 of those, right? And so this is really, really good news. And Melchizedek shows up in Genesis. This is in the time of Abraham, so we're talking before Moses, before Aaron. Aaron was Moses' right-hand man, and he set up the priesthood of Israel. This is before then. Melchizedek shows up in the time of Abraham, seemingly out of nowhere. No lineage before him, no lineage after him. He just kind of pops up, and he's gone. He was the king of Salem, which, interestingly enough, for our psalm, hopefully this strikes you as significant, Salem was the area that would eventually become Jerusalem. He's the king of Salem, and he's not only a king, he's a priest. He's both. So he's ruling and reigning over the people of Salem and ministering. And the Old Testament says that he is a minister, a priest of the Most High God. So there's a couple of views about who Melchizedek is. Some scholars say that actually he is the eternal Son of God before the incarnation. That we would call that a pre-incarnate Christ. The technical word, again, for those of you who like the technical words, is Christophany. Christophany. And so there's some who believe that that's him. There's lots of reasons they believe that. They're like, well, there's no lineage, and he just kind of pops up, and he's gone. And then there's some scholars who believe, no, he was just a Canaanite king, and there were Canaanite kings in that day who still worshipped the one true God. They were starting to steer over toward polytheism and having all these other gods, one of whom would be known as Baal, and he would kind of raise to the top eventually. But early in those days, there were still Canaanites who were worshiping the one true creator God. And so there's some who believe that he was just a Canaanite king who was also a priest. And what happened is that Abraham wins this battle. This is all Genesis 14 if you want to go read the whole story. Abraham wins this battle, and he brings 1/10 of his spoils to Melchizedek. And Melchizedek comes out and feeds him and blesses him. So it doesn't, for the purpose of this passage this morning, whether you take the view that Melchizedek is the pre-incarnate Christ or that he was just a Canaanite king and would be known as a type of Christ, regardless of which one of those you think it is, here's the point. This psalm is saying that the coming king, the eternal king who's coming through David's lineage, will also be a priest. He'll be a king and a priest, just like Melchizedek, right? And that he is coming as a king priest whose priesthood is from before Aaron, just like Melchizedek, right? So regardless of who you believe Melchizedek is, it still has the same purpose for this psalm. He's a king who is also a priest, who is part of a priesthood before the priesthood, both of which are true. And God is making an oath to the king of Israel. You will be king and priest, not after the order of Aaron. That's too recent. But after a longer lasting more certain, more foundational order of priesthood, the priesthood of Melchizedek. And then in verse 5, the people start to sing to each other about this king of Israel. We have lowercase Lord at the beginning of this verse. Everybody see that? Lowercase Lord. Verse 5, the Lord is at your right hand. He will shatter kings on the day of his wrath. What good news for these people who are so often quaking in the face of their enemies. You could hear their knees knocking together. And that this king would come out into their midst and defeat their enemies with them. It's been one of the most astonishing things, and I know I'm referring to it a lot. It just has particular bearing on what we're looking at today and this notion of victory. I don't know if you guys have all seen the footage of President Volodymyr Zelensky from Ukraine, and he has actually been visiting the bunkers of the soldiers who are fighting off the Russians in person. I mean, can you imagine being hunkered down? Oh man, the Russians are coming, right? And you're holding your rations, you're holding your weapon, and there's a knock at the door, and the president walks in. How you guys doing? Need anything? Right? You'd be like, let's go, right? I mean, like, you'd just be ready to go. There was one video that I saw where it had been started to be spread as rumors throughout the Russian military that he had fled the country. And so 2 hours later, there he was standing on the streets of the capital with his cabinet around him saying, "We're here." Incredible to have a leader fighting with you and for you. This was my favorite article here. Ukrainian president, I'm reading here from the article, Ukrainian president Volodymyr Zelensky, if I'm mispronouncing that, please forgive me. Volodymyr Zelensky was asked to evacuate Kiev at the behest of the U.S. government, but turned down the offer. Zelensky said in response, "The fight is here. I need ammunition, not a ride."
I love it.
According to a senior American intelligence official with direct knowledge of the conversation, who described Zelensky as upbeat, courage, and how much more for the people of Israel to hear the Lord, the current king, and fulfilled in the coming eternal king, is at your right hand. He will shatter kings on the day of his wrath. Incredible. Verse 6. He will execute judgment among the nations, filling them with corpses. That's pretty intense. There's a lot of imagery there, but we've got our K through 5th graders in here, so I won't go any further than that. This king's stacking them high. Filling them with corpses, he will shatter chiefs over the wide earth. You know, David knew a thing or two about this type of victory. Think back to when David was just a small boy. And the people of Israel, you could hear their knees knocking together, entrenched on one side of a gulf, and the Philistines entrenched on the other side of the gulf. And the way that battle worked back then is you send in your best guy, and whichever best guy emerged, that was who won. And their best guy was really big. He was named Goliath. He was a giant. He was rude. mocking. He was the epitome of a bully, standing in the gap for the Philistines. And David comes up and goes, is no one going to step in there? Are we going to let this guy talk about our God that way? And everyone around him said, yep. And David said, no way. I'm going down there. You're a kid. The Lord is with me. I actually wonder if he was thinking, I mean, if I go down there and he kills me, he's going to have a lot of people on his hands. I don't know if that's the case or not. I believe David trusted the Lord. He trusted that God would take care of this brute. And so he went and stood in the gap. And to finish that story, would run into the same imagery that I was skipping over before because there are kids present. But that word chiefs can also be translated heads. This psalm is written by a king who knew a thing or two about taking on the one in charge. And his people, don't you think everyone told that story all the time about David? That when he was just a kid, he took on Goliath. And that wasn't a demonstration of David's ability, it was a demonstration of God's ability. And the same God is promising here to work through the king of Israel, their current king, and the king who is to come through him. Should really be no surprise to us that this is one of the most quoted Old Testament passages in the New Testament. There's no wonder they were always singing this song. What a song of comfort for God's people. It's a shocking image. He will execute judgment among the nations, filling them with corpses. He will shatter chiefs over the wide earth. This isn't going to just be a local victory. It's going to be a worldwide victory. Verse 7. The image changes. He will drink from the brook by the way. Therefore, he will lift up his head. Earlier in the passage, I just realized I skipped over it, so we'll go back and cover it, because I'm going to cover the whole thing. There was this image of, from the womb of the morning, the dew of your youth will be yours. That in wartime, this king, anybody ever drank dew before? Me either. Oh, you have? Oh, you didn't raise your hand. Okay, I've never drank dew before. It seems like it might be enough to get by, but I'm kind of a city kid, and I don't want to have to work that hard for my water. It might be enough to get by, but in wartime, that's what you're doing. You're getting by. Here's the good thing about dew. It shows up every morning. You can always count on it. And here, God is promising that he will give the king of Israel what he needs while the battle is raging. But the image is totally different at the end. Verse 7 again. He will drink from the brook by the way. Therefore, he will lift up his head. This is no longer intermittent sustenance, no longer wartime just enough sustenance. His source is now a flowing brook that while he's by the way, he can reach down into and drink from. It's no longer wartime. He's fully and completely satisfied. And he lifts up his head. and looks at his victory. So what are we to make of this psalm? It seems to me that all this leads us to one big takeaway, and it's this. God's promised victory is only a matter of time. He is promising to his people in this passage. He is promising to his people who are reading the letter from the author of Hebrews. He promises to us, victory is only a matter of time. And all of that comes from that word in verse 1, until. Sit at my right hand in this place of favor, in this place of prominence. You sit right here until I make your enemies your footstool. Until you see victory. Not, and if you do, you'll see victory. Not, when you do, you'll see victory. It's unconditional. God's victory is only a matter of time.
Amen.
But you have to remember it's God's promised victory, not yours. It can be really easy as we move into application on a passage like this to be like, what victory do you need in your life? If we're all being honest before the Lord, we should say, I don't know. This victory doesn't always look the way we expect it to look. And we learned that when the eternal King of Israel, while we were still sinners, was born and died on a cross. Given this passage, would you not have been confused as the people of Israel? Wait a second. That's the victory? But New Life, that was only Friday. On Sunday, he who had laid down his life took it back up again.
That's right.
And he went to heaven, and he is seated at the right hand of God the Father Almighty, from where he will come to judge the living and the dead. This is still the same king. The king they were looking forward to, we get to look back on and up to. The same king. So how should we respond as the people of God? Actually, the same way that this psalm says the people of God are to respond. To offer ourselves freely, dressed for the occasion. We're going to offer ourselves freely to the building of your kingdom, King. We're going to offer ourselves freely, and when we show up, you'll be able to tell by the way we're dressed whose team we're on and how we expect this to end. That's a place of immense hope, immense confidence to be. And what are the holy garments? I mean, so I don't think, just so you know, I don't think that for us putting on the holy garments, the garments of the king, necessarily mean, wearing a collared shirt or a dress or anything like that. I don't think that's it. In fact, I think that Paul starts to hint at an answer to this question in Colossians 3:12 through 14, where he tells the people in Colossae to put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other, as the Lord has forgiven you, so you must also forgive. And above all these, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. Holy garments, set apart ones. As Emily and I sang that song in our apartment, probably for the 50th time, but it was like it was for the first time. The lyrics concluded, "When I find myself so far from home, and you lead me somewhere I don't want to go, even in my death I'll follow you. When I come to end this race I've run, and I receive the prize that Christ has won, not that I have won, when I receive the prize that Christ has won, I will be with you in paradise." Amen. Our hope endures in the King of Israel. They meant that as a slight when they put it above him on the cross, the King of the Jews, but it is a term of exaltation for us, that he is the King of Israel. He is the eternal King of Israel. Our hope endures in the King of Israel because God is with him and will fight through him and for him. Let's stand and sing.